As I've described in my various writings, the concept of cultural maturity helps us in three primary ways. First and most obviously, it gives us a new guiding narrative. At times when our familiar stories from the American dream to our various political, spiritual ideologies serve us less and less well, it provides a compass for moving forward and making our choices in ultimately useful and life-affirming ways. It also lays out specific new capacities that we need if we are going to make good decisions going forward, from ability to relate to limits in new ways, the ability to get beyond projections, the ability to understand the truth we use in more encompassing and complete ways. And the third one is it really makes understandable the importance of thinking in some fundamentally new ways as we go forward. It talks in terms of a kind of cognitive reordering that in fact is defining the times in which we live, what becomes possible in what we live, how the world looks in the times in which we live. There's one more thing it does, which is really implied in each of those steps, is that it helps us separate the wheat from the chaff as we look toward the future. We can use the concept of cultural maturity as a lens to distinguish ideas that can successfully help us, support us as we go forward, and those which either are not going to be terribly helpful or could even get in the way of us making good decisions. An interesting piece in that, which we should look at a bit first before we look at some of those specific separating wheat from chaff tools that it provides, is that it also engages in making a different kind of distinction than we have before. Each of those wheat from chaff concepts, tools that we draw on is a more dynamic and systemic kind of tool than we've used to make distinctions in time past. Indeed, distinction comes to mean something than it's meant in times past. So quickly, just to get started, I'm going to put that a bit in historical perspective, and we can use the image of cultural maturity like stepping over a threshold into a new territory that I often use as the way to talk about those kinds of distinctions. We can talk about distinctions that are the way we made distinction and relate to the whole concept of making distinctions previous to that threshold. We can talk about how they begin to change when we begin to get at the threshold, and we can talk about how the nature of distinction and how we relate to the whole process of making distinctions changes once we step over cultural maturity's threshold. So prior to cultural maturity, we're in modern age reality in which our stories are heroic and romantic, in which we see identity in terms of individuality, in terms of truth, in terms of rationality, and we tend to make our distinctions in terms of categories and in terms of polar juxtapositions, be it rational and irrational, left and right in the political arena, masculine and feminine when we're thinking about gender identity, allies and enemies when we're on the global stage. You step back and realize that within that context, within that time, that particular way, those particular ways of making distinctions served us very well and work just fine. The thinking of Descartes and Newton, dividing objective and subjective, that's the best and most useful and timely way of thinking about truth and difference. Left and right in the political arena, as I describe in other areas, it's like having juxtaposed left and right who are arguing and trying to find compromise, in fact, propelled decision-making going forward. Seeing masculine and feminine as a polar opposite allowed the kind of two halves makes a whole relationships which create the magnetism of romantic love. So that was a reality that worked. As I describe in other areas, it has worked, and increasingly that way of making distinctions is not only not providing solutions for us, it's not giving us a way to adequately grasp the kinds of questions that we have to engage. Okay, so what happens when we get closer to cultural maturity's threshold? Well, we get a very different relationship to making distinctions, and what's often spoken of is a postmodern perspective. And in a postmodern perspective, there's a real questioning of the absolute authority of cultural beliefs. There's a questioning of the past projections, polarizations, the ideological assumptions that we've had in the past. But at the same time, it's very much an in-between, creative systems theory calls transitional kind of period in relationship to making distinctions, in which we very easily get into really an aversion to making strong distinctions. We easily get a kind of different strokes for different folks reality in which there is just difference and different for its own sake. So we get beyond the ideological distortions. We get beyond the kind of ideological distortions we've had before. We are willing to bring some perspective to seeing the projections that we've made. There's an attempt to see things in fuller ways, but we don't see things in fuller ways in a way that really allows us to make distinctions with any real depth. As a matter of fact, there's a real common aversion to making any kind of real detailed discriminations of this and opposed to that. One says, "Hey, you're being judgmental. You don't want to be judgmental here." So that's a step. Once we step over cultural maturity's threshold, we step into a territory in which, once again, we are able to make distinctions. There is not a fear of being judgmental. The issue is not being judgmental. It's making sure one is judging in ways that actually see the full picture that one needs to be making one's discriminations in. So within cultural mature territory, one steps beyond a reality in which culture is parent and defined in terms of absolutes. One's stepping beyond a reality of polar projections. One's stepping into a reality in which one's able to hold the larger systemic complexity and the dynamism of the issues that one's engaged in. And in the process with that, it's bringing to bear very new kinds of tools for making distinctions. And those can take lots of different forms. Creative systems theory is one framework for making a lot of those kinds of distinctions, whether you're dealing with developmental distinctions over time or differences between personality styles or how spiritual or scientific or political beliefs are ordered in different kinds of contexts. One's able to think about truths in much more contextual ways. But that becomes the task. All of that applies to making this as opposed to that distinctions in all parts of our lives. But our particular interest here is how we look at the future. And for that, creative systems theory gives us a bunch of very specific tools that we can use for teasing apart what can help us and what doesn't help us as we look to the future. We can think of that threshold image as the first one. And once one sort of grasps that progression, then with any kind of idea, you can ask yourself, does it stop short of cultural maturity's threshold? Are we still in a heroic, romantic, individualist, rationalist view of the world that's caught in projection and polar ideology, or are we somehow getting beyond that? And in getting beyond that, are we simply stopping with a kind of postmodern, anything goes kind of different strokes for different folks kind of worldview, which can get us up to that transitional place on the threshold? Or in our thinking, are we beginning to get beyond that? Are we beginning to get into territory where we're beginning to better hold the full systemic nature of whatever is going on in a situation with all its dynamic contingencies? And there we can really also then ask ourselves, we can go, well, is this just taking just a first baby step into culturally mature territory? Or you can go, is this idea a little bit more than that? Is that a good solid step into culturally mature territories? Or even at our best these days, we're one or two, maybe a little more. That's as good as we can do right now. But those distinctions are really important, and we can, and notice that that's a kind of distinction that we can make. We can make with a great deal of assertion. There can be a fear of making strong assertions that comes from that postmodern place, where you're really afraid in making distinctions that you're going to fall back into the ideological worldviews that you've stepped out of. And I'd say one of the things we really want to be able to do is I can't tell you exactly what culture mature thinking looks like here, but I can say with a high degree of certainty that culture mature thought is what's needed for going forward, and here's some of the characteristics of cultural mature perspective, and here in a situation is why it might be lacking. And I think that's a kind of strength of assertion that we have to be willing to make in our time. So let's use the threshold image to make a few now more specific distinctions. There's a couple kind of worldviews that are important to identify because they specifically just stop short of the threshold. Okay, we could call the first one we've arrived beliefs. Okay, they're basically beliefs that say the basic assumptions that we have used to think over the last few hundred years are in fact right and true ideals and endpoints, and can carry us perhaps with some minor refinements on into the future. And there we could be talking about free market capitalism as we think about it, institutional democracy, monotheistic religious forms, romantic love, the nuclear family as we think about it, contemporary notions of higher education. Less obvious than that, some of our common ideas about individuality, what it means to be an individual, ideas about how we think. Each of those, creative systems theory and the concept of cultural maturity, challenge fundamentally how we even think about intelligence and what all it encompasses is a critical piece of creative systems theory's perspective. In each case, the concept of cultural maturity makes clear that these are not endpoints, that these are not ideals, that we can understand them as ways of thinking, ways of approaching our realities, ways of approaching relationships in our lives, that in fact have served us powerfully and creatively in a time that we have been in. But that further steps lie ahead and need to lie ahead if we are to make our choices in any way effective ways as we go forward. The second view of the future that stops wholly short of cultural maturity's threshold is almost the opposite. We could call them we've gone astray beliefs. And with we've gone astray beliefs, advocates see that in some way we're really in trouble, and we failed, and generally that we failed in really some fundamental way. And the most extreme form of that would be sort of Armageddon beliefs from an extreme fundamentalist perspective. We also see media depictions of dystopian cataclysm as we look toward the future. We also find a lot of less obvious, but in fact just as doubting, just as gone astray, ultimately just as undermining a possibility in many ways, views that from both the political right and the political left that really perceive us living in times in which we're in some way going to hell in a handbasket. The concept of cultural maturity says that indeed we're in challenging transitional times. They are times where often we are doing some pretty nutty stuff. In my writings and other videos, I talk about the notion of transitional absurdity. There's ways in which, in overshooting the mark in the times that we are, we do and think some things that are quite ludicrous and could be our undoing. But at the same time, it says that our basic nature is growth, and indeed it says that there are that the questions that are challenging us in our time are rich questions, and that at least the potential for the kind of capacities we need to engage those questions is developmentally, the potential is developmentally built into us, and our task is really one of the courage and perspective we can bring to our time, and with that we have the potential to have a future, that is not just positive. It could be really profound. So that's a really quite different kind of picture than either we've arrived beliefs that hold on to established ways of thinking and worldviews as the answer, or we've gone astray as assumption that assumes that we have erred in some fundamental way. Okay, let's turn now to 3 ways of making sense of our times and looking toward the future that, at their best, at least get a toe over cultural maturity's threshold. Okay? The first is probably most familiar, and we could talk of them as post-industrial information age ideas about the future. Such notions treat invention as the primary driver of cultural change and see the future in terms of new inventions that will transform society, the world around us, ourselves in dramatic new ways. They tend to make technology the solution. They're common in popular culture, common in academia, probably the most common way of thinking about the future in futurist circles, and they're ideas that the digital revolution has given a new generation of adherents and some new images of possibility. Cultural maturity very much affirms technology's essential role in the future, and it also challenges really basic assumptions within a post-industrial information age worldview. Most obviously, it cautions against assuming that the consequences in any invention are necessarily going to be positive. Inventing is not at all the same thing, obviously, as inventing wisely. Um, it also argues that technological solutions rarely in and of themselves will be adequate for addressing future challenges. They don't in and of themselves provide imagery which is ultimately compelling, and also when it comes to, I mean, most of the challenges that confront us are human challenges. They're challenges that have to do with how we understand, how we see the world, our ability to grasp a sufficient complexity, and technological solutions by themselves don't provide that for us. One other thing a culturally mature perspective does is challenge the whole worldview that comes out of the idea that that technology is the driver of cultural change. Creative systems theory would argue that in its developmental evolutionary picture that's half of it, but that the causality goes both ways. Indeed, new technology drives what's possible in a culture, but it's equally the case that the worldview, the way of holding reality, the cognitive underlying processes that define a reality of a particular time in culture, define what technologies we are able to conceive of and make use of in any effective way. The best of post-industrial information age ideas help get us a toe over cultural maturity threshold. I think that's particularly so with some of the ideas that come out of the digital revolution, because they really are challenging us to bring a kind of dynamism to our thinking, particularly as we're dealing with a combination of a global world and new communication technologies. It's helping move us into that territory. But the worst of post-industrial information age ideas stop wholly short. At the very least, we have they just become an extension of the industrial age's onward and upward picture. They protect us from having to look as deeply as we need to look at ourselves in terms of the fundamental expansion of perspective required in how we understand ourselves and how we understand in general, and can get in the way of being able to do that because we actually think that's an adequate way of seeing the world. It's also the case that we find things advocated out of that basic way of seeing things that really represent transitional absurdity, that really represent overshooting the mark in a way that really is ultimately not helpful at all. I think of some of the more extreme views that come out of notions of artificial intelligence, for example, ideas that are that we can download our intelligence, and by virtue of downloading our intelligence, we can have eternal life. And I'd say there we have another sort of ultimately limits denying story that reflects a really very naive view of both intelligence and of life, ultimately. Well, let's touch on another way of thinking that often gets a good toe over cultural maturity's threshold. And it takes us back to my earlier reflections when I talked about the sort of historical process we're in. And these are what we could call, just to have a term, postmodern constructivist beliefs. They've had a very important role in academic thought over the last 30, 40, 50 years. We see them with existentialism, social constructivism, and the best of such thinking certainly takes us up to the threshold. It fundamentally challenges absolutist beliefs, projections, ideologies. It points out that ideas vary widely between cultures, evolve over time, and are subject to human manipulation. All those are very important awarenesses to help us get up to that threshold. But postmodern constructivist beliefs also ultimately fail us if we want to look very far into the future. They don't really help us understand why we're seeing such a fundamental challenging of past beliefs in our time. And of particular importance, they don't really help us understand, they really don't help give us anything to fundamentally replace what they have so insightfully taken away. They offer a picture of multiple realities, but tend not to make strong value judgments within those multiple realities. Indeed, they tend to have kind of an aversion to making those value judgments. We end up with a different strokes for different folks kind of reality very often. Indeed, there's a kind of undermining of the ability to make the kinds of distinctions that we need to make. I think of Jean Lyotard's statement that with such thinking we have an incredulity toward meta-narratives. There's a fear of looking with any great detail and conviction that if in doing so one will just regress back to the absolute beliefs of times past. I think of about 25 years ago I gave a presentation to a group of constructivists and on creative systems theory, and partway through someone raised their hand and said, well, isn't that just all a construct? And I said, well, of course it's a construct. Everything's a construct in our beliefs. The question is not whether it's a construct, the question is whether it's a good construct. The question is whether it's a right and timely construct, one that can provide guidance and leadership as we go forward. For the most part, we find postmodern constructivist beliefs in formal academic thought, but we see it also increasingly in popular expression in the media, which we would expect if the kind of evolutionary ideas I'm putting forward are accurate. We often see a kind of a postmodern irony, glibness, kind of randomness in the name of significance that gets us a good part of the way, but still leaves us short. And we see it in some of the best of media. I think of Ira Glass's This American Life on National Public Radio, which I think early on made a very important contribution toward helping us see through beyond heroic romantic ideological ways of seeing things, but increasingly it kind of reduces to postmodern glibness, to irony, and I think we see that increasingly in public media, where particularly that which focuses for a younger demographic, and it gives us a start. But we need to do a whole lot better if either our formal academic thought or our contributions in the media are really going to help us going forward. Well, let's take one more that gets, at least at times, a good toe over cultural maturity's threshold. And we could speak of them, for lack of a better term, as new paradigm transformational interpretations. And I think here what we're seeing is at least an assertion that part of what our times are asking of us is that we do think in some fundamentally new ways. And here we see really some of the best of emergent thought, and we also see some of the most naive and simplistic of emergent thought. And I think, certainly in some of the best of it, we see some of the best of thinking in new science, such as in quantum mechanics and the sciences of complexity, which are helping us see in more dynamic ways that are still mechanistic, but include uncertainty as part of the picture, really stretch how we thought about things. We see, I think there's important thinking that comes out of thinking about leadership and organizational process, learning organizations. All of these things are saying, okay, we have to hold a bigger picture than we have before, and it includes uncertainty, and it includes change, and that's a stretch we need to learn how to do it. That's the best. As I said, it's also the case that with new paradigm transformational ideas, one also sees some of the more limited, and unfortunately they can often get confused with one another. In a moment I'll come back with some tools that help tease apart those differences. The most limited we see is in simplistic kinds of New Age sorts of thinking that confuse the kind of complexity and completeness of thought that we need with simplistic spiritual answers. And sometimes there's at least certainly some of those ideas are motivated by a recognition of some of the important questions that we face in our time, but also too what we get is very frequently not just ideas that aren't really taking us forward. In fact, often they're taking us back, and often romantically taking us back to in ways that even don't even fully do justice to what have been the realities of times past. So our simple threshold image gives us one basic compare and contrast tool. Let me toss out a small handful of others that can help provide both additional insight and help us reflect back on some of the observations I've just made. One key tool within creative systems theory is the notion of polar fallacies. Creative systems theory describes how reality orders creatively and how the generation of polarity is an inherent part of the early developmental stages within any formative process, and that a major portion of what's happening with cultural maturity is we're beginning to step back and see that larger process, and in doing so beginning to engage a more integrative, more systemic picture that steps beyond that polar reality. It doesn't mush things together. It doesn't make it into a unity. It allows us to see that larger, more nuanced, more sophisticated picture. Well, when one stops short, one can stop short basically in terms of polarity in three different ways. And creative systems theory calls them separation fallacies, compromise fallacies, and unity fallacies. In the end, the ultimate polarity is not between opposing allegiances. The ultimate polarity is between unity on one hand and multiplicity on the other. So you can identify with multiplicity, and that's a separation fallacy. You can identify with unity and confuse that with wholeness, and that's a unity fallacy. And compromise fallacies split the difference. There's a related image, and we'll tie out in a moment. I'll tie those back to some of the observations we just made, but I'll give you another image that can help us in even a more nuanced way make those same distinctions. And it's a really key image for thinking about culturally mature thought, and it's the idea of a box of crayons, that we can think of the kind of cognitive changes, that we can think of the kind of integrative meta-perspective that our time is about learning for us to engage, the ability to step back from our complexity and also more deeply engage the fullness of our complexity as like a box of crayons. We have to hold the whole box, and we have to, in increasingly nuanced ways, understand the richness of the contribution of each of the parts of each of the crayons in that. I often do what I call parts work with people, which in another video I talk about. Instead of a box of crayons, we use the metaphor like characters in a play on a stage, and set up the room like with different chairs in the room, like those multiple parts in ourselves. And then the task is to be able to sit in one's chair and hold that larger complexity, not confuse oneself with those parts, but also to embrace and hold the whole of the complexity of those parts. So we can look at those. So there's a couple more tools to draw on: the notion of polar fallacies and the whole box of crayons image of systemic complexity, and we can use those to reflect back a bit on those. On the ways of thinking about the future that I just reflected on, that at least get a toe into culturally mature territory. When we're talking about technological information age, views. Sometimes they begin to help us bridge. Sometimes they begin to hold that larger complexity. But they, along with more academic views that tend to put the rational as what is ultimate truth. Notice creative systems theory is always saying we have to hold the whole multiplicity of our multiple intelligences, and those are one of the best ways of thinking about all the crayons in the box is that the multiple aspects of human intelligence that we now have to be able to hold and embrace and apply to everything that we're attempting to do. So with technological answers, with academic answers, we're going to be most vulnerable to falling for separation fallacies. It's putting things into simplistic categories, into an individualistic world. Put it in psychological terms, it's the harder, more archetypally masculine aspects of reality that end up becoming the defining truth. If we are doing parts work in the room, it's like someone who comes from a more academic or technological background is likely to see the part in the room that thinks in technological or academic terms as the place that holds final truth. In fact, that part does not hold final truth. That's one very important, a critical part to be able to draw on, but it's only one aspect of our larger systemic complexity. Okay, when we're dealing with compromise fallacies, one of the most common places there is coming back to the postmodern kind of view, in which there we're sort of saying, oh, well, there's just lots of different crayons, and it doesn't, and the cultural maturity says, yes, well, there are multiple crayons, and it is the case that no one crayon gets to have truth. But it's also the case, it's not arbitrary which crayon you choose, and it's also the case that we're not just mushing the crayons together, that we end up there with just shades of gray, which really doesn't take us very far at all, other than helping us get beyond some more common traps of times past. But our task ultimately is to hold that whole box of crayons in its rich, full vibrancy, and to live and act in the world from ourselves as a whole person, as a whole system in the world. And that's something very different than compromise fallacies. Okay, and notice what we're doing with when we fall short in terms of new paradigm views and confuse in the more simplistic interpretations that in fact has a more spiritual interpretation. What we're confusing there is the kind of wholeness we want of holding the whole box of crayons, or fully bridging polarity with instead identify with the half of polarity which identifies with unity, or identifying with the character with the crayon in the box, which in fact is unity. When you have a more spiritual worldview, what one assumes is that the spiritual crayon, or the spiritual character, if one's doing part work, in fact is sitting in the central chair, that is where one finds ultimate truth. One of the first steps one does in working with someone who tends to fall for those kinds of traps is you have to say, no, the unitary chair, the spiritual chair is wonderful, is important. It's one of the chairs that we've frequently forgotten in modern times in our individualistic, materialistic, often very archetypally masculine world. But on the other hand, it's not the last word. It's not the last word. It too is a part, and you can only be rich and full in one's spirituality in any mature kind of way to the degree you can recognize that in fact is the case. It's useful to recognize that we can see any of these three kinds of traps and partialities with ideas which are called systems thinking. Systems ideas are unusual for the diversity of ideological beliefs they can be used to support. Some of the most traditional of systems thinking that focuses on feedback loops, and simply the fact of complexity and multiplicity of parts. We're really talking about the kind of systems that could be the systems of parts of a car, but also parts of an environment. When we're thinking in those terms, we're dealing with a more complex machine, but we're still really in a machine reality for the most part. So there's vulnerability towards separation fallacies there. We can also have systems ideas which really what they're focusing on is just that there are a whole lot of aspects and parts to things, and that's an important step forward, but really we're kind of in compromise fallacy and kind of in postmodern territory with how we're using systems language in that kind of situation. It's also the case in some of the more popular systems, thinking of that we often see that same confusion of wholeness with oneness, and systems language ends up getting used as just another way of talking about everything being connected in some way. And of course, mature systems view recognizes that everything is connected, and it also realizes that just as important is the recognition of just how fundamentally different all the parts in complex systems inherently and necessarily are. The observation that I made just a moment ago that the more archetypally feminine parts of us are parts that we have often lost touch with in modern times helps give us one other tool that's important to draw on. Probably the most common misconceptions, most common confusions between other kinds of thought and cultural maturity when people first encounter the concept is that people may confuse cultural mature thought with either more liberal humanistic thought or perhaps some forms of spiritual thought. And in fact, I think one should get clearly from what I said before that with cultural mature, we're dealing with something fundamentally wholly different than either of those. But there's ways in which the confusion initially is understandable, that confusion, creative systems theory has a term for it. It calls it the feminine mistake, with all apologies to Betty Friedan. And that is that it is that I was suggesting is that if you look at the story of the evolution of culture, we've gone from a time when the more archetypally feminine, softer, more left-hand capacities were really the more defining qualities that that made us human and how we thought, to in more modern, more industrial, more rationalist times, more individualistic times, it's very much more the archetypally masculine that has predominated. Well, with an integrated meta-perspective, with cultural maturity, with the ability to think with more systemic complexity, guess what? The archetypally feminine becomes now part of the larger conversation, part of the systemic whole that one has to grasp in order to think with the kind of new objectivity and completeness of perspective that's needed to engage the kind of questions that lie ahead for that. Well, notice the interesting, the easy place where you might have confusion, because the archetypally feminine now has again a place. One could say, oh, that's wonderful. However, confuse it with views that in fact make the archetypally feminine primary. And there's a variety of different kinds of those. Certainly the liberal humanistic view, and we can see it with environmental, we can see it with some of the softer forms of feminism. Again, there's an identification with the archetypally feminine. We can easily make that that character, what is ultimate truth, and stop short of a larger picture in the name of what looks like new thought, but in fact isn't really anything particularly new. I think some of the trickiest ones to tease out here, and they're not ultimately tricky, it comes back to the same thing, is that we're dealing with something fundamentally wholly different. but they're views which reflect a kind of philosophical idealism. Philosophical idealism includes both the archetypally masculine and the archetypally feminine, except it makes the archetypally feminine, okay, or the spiritual, the driving force. The spiritual drives the material, the archetypally feminine drives the archetypally masculine. Within a culture mature view, at least within creative systems formulation, it's like the left hand, the right hand are co-generative, and what we get with philosophical idealism is a magical idealized picture of possibility. There's lots of contemporary forms of philosophical idealism, but we can look back historically to some significant figures just to get a sense of how it works. I think of the Christian monk Teilhard de Chardin, who postulated a final omega point for culture, a sort of collective enlightenment that we would eventually arrive at. Or from a more political direction, I think of the philosopher George Hegel, who postulated eventually arriving at an idealized political solution, an idealized Prussian state. Well, like I said, there's a lot of contemporary forms, and people use the word integral thought, which could easily be confused with what I'm talking about. Generally, we're talking about a form of philosophical idealism. Often the questions that are being asked are very good questions, but we end up in the end with a kind of magically idealized picture of the future, which in fact ultimately doesn't capture the larger picture of what we need to grasp. Cultural maturity is not about idealized outcomes. It's simply about seeing things more clearly and more fully, grasping the complexity of how things work. It's important to appreciate with any of the kinds of traps and fallacies I've talked about, any of the ways our thinking can stop short. We're dealing with something much more significant than misplaced understanding. If not challenged, the result can be the undermining of the kind of expansion and perspective that our times are asking of us. Creative systems theory defines violence as anything that does harm to the aliveness or capacity of a system, that undermines its ability to function fully. And we find that today, anytime we confuse any of these more limited worldviews with the magnitude of perspective that we need to bring to the important questions that we're facing. Certainly, it's the case if we're bringing an isolatedly rationalistic or technological view to views that require perspective that in fact has a deeper understanding of who we are as human beings and the ultimate nature of intelligence and the nature of what it means to be alive and to have meaning as human beings. In doing that, we undermine our ability to hold things large enough. And it's just as much the case with any of the views that in fact confuse the needed systemic complexity with a more archetypally feminine kind of solution. In many ways, often those can be most destructive in terms of the functioning of organizations and effective leadership, because it becomes it's often not as easy to see what's getting in the way of seeing the larger perspective. I know in my own experience, it's often more difficult working with a group that is likely to sort of fall off the left side of the road into the more liberal or spiritual side of things than it is to work with people who might initially much more oppose what I have to say and want to fight with me in terms of coming from a much more conservative or fundamentalist kind of place. It's important to recognize that various temperaments, personality styles are variously vulnerable to different ones of these partialities, limited ways of looking forward. Any Any temperament with enough capacitance is fully capable of culturally mature thinking. No temperament has a monopoly on those abilities. Indeed, any personality style with sufficient capacitance is going to naturally find itself beginning to think in more culturally mature ways. Importantly, that observation applies not just to individuals, but also to groups and association. We can think of different temperaments like those crayons in the box, and it's simply the case that if you look at most any organization, any group that brings together people, they tend to bring together people around a particular way of holding reality. So within those groups, you're similarly going to have a bias toward certain more limited ways of seeing the world. So you're going to have a group that, in fact, is drawing together people who find an attraction to neuroscientism, or you're going to draw together a group the people who are attracted to philosophical idealism. So often a group, what you have is an identification with superior thinking, with enlightened thinking in some kind of a way, which in fact is its own kind of a chosen people allegiance. Our kind have the answer, but in fact it's very often, and the larger portion of the time right now, it's a single crayon story of how the world works, and therefore limited when it comes to the tasks of cultural maturity. So, in summary, it's essential that one is attentive to one's own, the partialities, the traps that one can be vulnerable to, that can get in the way of holding the kind of leadership we need going forward and seeing the future in effective ways. In the past, when I've done trainings, and they're usually quite selective and over a long period of time, and I've worked with people, I've selected people for those trainings in a combination of them people having high capacitance, that is, they're people who can get themselves over cultural maturity's threshold and deal with complexity without being overwhelmed by it. But I've also very much attempted to bring maximum diversity in the room, in the sense of temperament diversity, in terms of bringing all the crayons in the box into the room, so that we could be working together, so that we could be holding that larger complexity as we engage working together. There's another way to do the same thing. If a group of people also has relatively high capacitance and they've done enough homework to understand the kinds of traps that we're talking about here, and the vulnerabilities, and how much it undermines what's possible if one falls for any of those kinds of traps and partialities, then it's possible to work with that kind of awareness. I will sometimes, when I'm working with a group that I know has a certain kind of bias, I will say, well, here's the questions we're going to be working on in a mini think tank kind of environment together, and given you as a group of people in that box of crayons, here's the kind of trap and vulnerability that you're most likely to fall for. And if you want to deal with this question that is clearly important to you as in a group, here's how you're going to fall off the road if you can't see that trap. With this question that's important to you, this is the pieces that you're going to miss if you can't see what's left out. People can then hear that if they've done enough homework ahead of time. And I've often enjoyed, when I work in that kind of context, it's like when I break a group up into mini think tank groups, they can work together almost like folks at an AA meeting. You can say, people can turn to each other and it'd be like, say, well, I am Anne, I'm a liberal humanist, I'm likely to fall for this kind of trap. Or I am John, and I'm an academic rationalist, and here's a trap that I can fall off, and I'm likely to leave this piece out of the equation. And when you can do that, then there's a kind of self-reflectiveness and a kind of mutual support in a larger process of holding the complexity that then becomes available to everybody in doing it. In summary, the task with with culturally mature thought is integrative meta-perspective. The task is to hold the whole box of crayons. The task is to step back and be able to hold the full complexity that makes us human, and in that think in ways that honor the fact that we're alive, and honor the fact that we're alive in the very particular audaciously meaning-making, tool-making, creative sense that makes us human. To do that is nothing esoteric. It's nothing extraordinary. It really is just common sense. It's about holding things as large as they are, seeing things separate from the projections and the idealizations and the romantizations that we've needed to bring things in time past. In many ways, it's about thinking in ways that are more ordinary. But to come back to the reality is that this is a level of common sense essential for going forward, but it's a level of common sense that we have not before as a species been capable of quite understanding or certainly manifesting in our daily lives. And right now, we have to be humble to the fact that at best we're able to take baby steps into that new territory of experience. But the concept of cultural maturity argues that, in fact, that is our task. And to do it effectively, one of the most important things we can do is do a little separating the wheat from the chaff, find our own potential blindnesses, and in the process, seek to hold the larger picture in the way that our times increasingly demand of us.